The crash of shattered ceramic against linoleum cut through the morning calm like a gunshot. In that instant, 50 chairs scraped backward across weathered wood flooring, their occupants rising as one in a display of solidarity that would forever change the trajectory of 3 interconnected lives. The porcelain coffee cup lay in fragments across the checkered floor of Murphy's Café, its contents spreading in dark rivulets between the black and white tiles. Above the wreckage stood Daniel Ashford, his tailored charcoal suit bearing fresh stains, his face flushed with indignation as he glared down at the young woman who knelt gathering the broken pieces with practiced efficiency. "Do you have any comprehension of what this suit costs?" Daniel's voice carried the particular edge of someone unaccustomed to inconvenience. "More than you earn in a month, I'd wager." The woman, her name tag read Emma, continued collecting ceramic shards without looking up, her movements deliberate and controlled. The burn spreading across her uniform where the scalding coffee had splashed told its own story, yet she worked in silence, her dignity intact despite the humiliation being heaped upon her. 50 men in leather vests watched this exchange unfold, their weathered faces registering everything from disappointment to barely restrained fury. These were the Iron Wolves, a motorcycle club composed entirely of military veterans, and they had not come to Murphy's Café seeking confrontation. They had come to honor the memory of Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, whose memorial ride would conclude at Arlington National Cemetery the following day. But as they witnessed Daniel's treatment of Emma Rodriguez, sister to their fallen brother, confrontation found them nonetheless. William "Bull" Morrison stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding from the corner booth where he'd been quietly nursing his coffee. At 58, Bull carried the weathered authority of a man who had commanded Marines through 3 combat deployments, his silver beard and steady grey eyes marking him as someone who had seen enough of life to know when lines were being crossed. "Sir," Bull's voice carried across the diner with the quiet authority that had once commanded respect in places where respect meant survival. "I believe you owe the young lady an apology." Daniel turned, his irritation shifting to something approaching alarm as he registered the wall of leather-clad veterans now standing throughout the café. "This doesn't concern you. When you disrespect the sister of a fallen Marine, it concerns all of us." Bull's tone remained conversational, yet something in his posture suggested this wasn't merely a suggestion. Emma finally looked up from the broken cup, her green eyes meeting Bull's with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had weathered storms that would have broken others. The dark circles beneath her eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent beside hospital beds, while her threadbare uniform testified to the kind of grinding financial pressure that accompanies prolonged family illness. What Daniel Ashford didn't know, couldn't have known from his privileged vantage point as regional vice president of Continental Trust Bank, was that Emma Rodriguez represented the convergence of his professional and personal failures. 6 months earlier, he had personally denied her mother's medical loan application, despite the family's stellar credit history and the guarantee of incoming VA benefits. 3 weeks ago, he had initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Rodriguez family home, timing the action to coincide with the anniversary of Michael's death. These weren't coincidences. They were calculated cruelties, born from knowledge Daniel possessed, but refused to acknowledge. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez had died saving the life of Lieutenant David Ashford, Daniel's younger brother. Margaret "Maggie" O'Brien emerged from behind the counter, her 60-year-old frame moving with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing chaos. A former army nurse who had served in field hospitals from Somalia to Iraq, Maggie had purchased Murphy's Café upon retiring from military service, transforming it into an unofficial gathering place for veterans and their families. "Problem here, gentlemen," Maggie's question was directed at Daniel, though her tone suggested she had already assessed the situation with military precision. Before Daniel could respond, the cafe's door swung open to admit a distinguished man in his early 60s. Senator James Patterson paused at the threshold, his experienced political instincts immediately recognizing the tension crackling through the air. "Bull Morrison," Patterson said, nodding toward the veteran leader. "Didn't expect to see the Iron Wolves in Millfield this morning?" "Senator," Bull acknowledged respectfully. "Annual memorial ride. Michael Rodriguez was one of ours." Patterson's expression shifted as he processed this information, his gaze moving from Bull to Emma to Daniel with growing understanding. As chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and more relevantly as the senior member of Continental Trust's board of directors, Patterson possessed detailed knowledge of the interconnected failures that had brought this confrontation to its current flashpoint. "Mr. Ashford," Patterson's voice carried the weight of senatorial authority, "perhaps we should discuss your banking committee meeting somewhere more private." Daniel's face paled as he recognized the potential political implications of his situation. "Senator, these people are creating a disturbance. They've been threatening me." "Threatening you how, exactly?" Patterson inquired mildly, his gaze taking in the disciplined formation of veterans who had positioned themselves throughout the café without appearing to move deliberately. Bull stepped forward, his movement casual yet somehow commanding attention. "No threats here, Senator. Just a simple matter of respect." "I see." Patterson studied the tableau before him. The spilled coffee, Emma's burned uniform, Daniel's defensive posture, and the quiet solidarity of 50 veterans who understood exactly what they were witnessing. "Mr. Ashford, I suggest you take a seat. We have several matters to discuss before your committee meeting." Daniel sank onto a bar stool, his carefully constructed world of corporate efficiency beginning to fracture under the weight of moral accountability he had long avoided. The phone in his pocket buzzed insistently, his superior at Continental Trust, no doubt demanding updates on the branch closure he was scheduled to implement that morning. Emma continued cleaning up the broken cup, her movements steady, despite the obvious pain from her burns. She had worked at Murphy's Café for 3 years, ever since withdrawing from medical school to care for her ailing mother and younger brother. The scholarship to Johns Hopkins had been her ticket out of Millfield, her path toward honoring the family tradition of military medicine that stretched back 3 generations. Then came her mother's cancer diagnosis. Then came her older brother's deployment to Afghanistan. And finally came the visit from 2 Marines in dress blues, bearing news that would shatter what remained of her family's foundation. "Emma," Maggie said gently, appearing beside her with first aid supplies, "that burn needs attention." "It's not bad," Emma replied automatically, the lie as reflexive as breathing after months of minimizing her family's struggles. 20 years as a field medic," Maggie observed, examining the red welts spreading across Emma's collarbone. "I know burns, girl. This needs treatment." As Maggie led Emma toward the back office, Bull turned his attention to Daniel, who sat staring into his untouched coffee with the expression of a man watching his professional identity dissolve in real time. "You know who she is," Bull said quietly. It wasn't a question. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup. "I know there are procedures for loan applications, committees that review them based on established criteria." "Look at me when you speak about her family," interjected Jake Patterson. No relation to the senator, but a former Army Ranger whose 20 years of special operations had left him with little patience for corporate euphemisms. Daniel met Jake's eyes reluctantly, finding there the kind of moral certainty he had spent years learning to avoid. It wasn't personal. Banking regulations require specific documentation timelines. "Your brother's alive because of hers," Bull observed, the simple truth impossible to counter with policy jargon. The statement hung in the air like smoke, toxic and inescapable. Everyone in the cafe now understood that Daniel's denial of the Rodriguez family's assistance wasn't merely corporate callousness, it was personal betrayal of the highest order. Emma returned from the back office, her burns now properly treated, but her uniform still bearing the stains of Daniel's carelessness. She moved behind the counter with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups for the Iron Wolves while avoiding Daniel's increasingly desperate gaze. "Ma'am," Bull addressed her with the formal courtesy he reserved for family members of fallen brothers, "we were hoping to visit Michael's memorial site before continuing to Arlington. Would that be acceptable to your family?" Emma's professional composure wavered for a moment, revealing the grief she worked so hard to contain. "He'd be honored. The site is beautiful, overlooks the valley where we grew up." "Your brother mentioned that valley," added Tony Valdez, a former Navy corpsman whose medical training had proved invaluable during the ambush outside Kandahar where Michael had died. "Said he could see his whole world from up there." Before Emma could respond, the cafe door opened again to admit a lanky teenager whose resemblance to both Emma and the fallen Marine was unmistakable. Alex Rodriguez, 16 and carrying the particular weight that settles on young shoulders when tragedy forces premature maturity, surveyed the unusual scene with wary intelligence. "Emma," Mrs. Patterson called, Alex reported, referring to their elderly neighbor. "Said there was some kind of situation here involving you and bikers." His protective concern for his sister was evident, and several of the Iron Wolves exchanged knowing looks. They recognized the dynamic, a boy forced to become the man of the house before he was ready. "These are Michael's brothers," Emma explained gently. "The Iron Wolves came to pay respects." Alex straightened instinctively, extending his hand to Bull with the careful formality of someone raised in a military family. The gesture brought fresh pain to Emma's eyes. Alex had inherited Michael's earnest dignity, his instinctive respect for those who had served. "Alex Rodriguez, sir. Michael was my older brother." "William Morrison," Bull replied, accepting the boy's handshake with matching formality. "Your brother saved my men outside Kandahar. That's not something we forget." As this exchange unfolded, Daniel's phone rang with the harsh urgency of corporate crisis management. He glanced at the screen before answering, his voice pitched for privacy, yet carrying in the suddenly quiet cafe. "Gerald, good morning. Yes, I'm in Millfield. The meeting is still scheduled for 10. The voice on the other end grew increasingly loud and demanding, audible even to those across the room. Daniel's expression shifted from professional calm to controlled panic as his superior berated him about FDIC pressure and quarterly numbers. When the call ended abruptly, leaving Daniel staring at his phone in humiliated silence, Senator Patterson stood with the measured authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. "Mr. Ashford," Patterson's tone brooked no argument. "I believe we need to have a conversation. All of us." What followed was a reckoning 18 months in the making. Daniel found himself confronted not merely with his professional failures, but with the human cost of choices made in corporate boardrooms, far from the consequences they created. The Iron Wolves listened as Patterson outlined the interconnected failures that had brought them to this moment: denied loans, foreclosure proceedings, and blocked medal reviews, all stemming from the same systematic devaluation of military families who had already given everything. Emma listened as Bull described her brother's final moments, how Michael had run into open ground under Taliban fire to rescue 4 Marines from a burning vehicle, including the young lieutenant, who happened to be Daniel's brother. Alex learned that his brother's Silver Star recommendation had been stalled for months by bureaucratic interference from people who preferred to keep heroic actions quiet rather than acknowledge the debts they created. and Daniel confronted the mathematical reality that no spreadsheet could calculate the worth of a man who had died so others could live, and the obligation such sacrifice placed on those who benefited from it. By the time the morning sun reached its zenith over Millfield, changes had begun to ripple outward like stones dropped in still water. Phone calls were made, policies reconsidered, and systems that had failed began the slow work of correction. The Iron Wolves mounted their motorcycles outside Murphy's Café, their formation now including Alex Rodriguez on the back of Bull's bike, heading toward the memorial site where they would honor Michael before continuing to Arlington. Emma stood in the cafe doorway, watching them go with the knowledge that her brother's sacrifice had finally received the recognition it deserved. Daniel Ashford remained at the counter, his expensive suit rumpled and his worldview fundamentally altered, beginning the difficult work of rebuilding a career and family relationships around principles he had forgotten he once possessed. And in Murphy's Café, where Maggie O'Brien continued serving coffee and comfort to anyone who needed both, the morning's events would become part of the establishment's ongoing story. Another chapter in the endless human drama of failure and redemption, of systems challenged and sometimes changed, of ordinary people finding the courage to stand for what was right. The sound of 50 motorcycles grew distant as they headed toward the hills where Michael Rodriguez lay at rest, their rumbling engines carrying both memorial and promise. That brotherhood extends beyond uniform and service into the realm of shared obligation, and that sometimes, when enough people choose to do what's right instead of what's convenient, even the most entrenched systems can be bent toward justice.